So today we actually have a wonderful panel for you. My name's Jill Hope Johnson. I get the opportunity to moderate this session. Basically, what we're going to try to help you to do is understand a little bit more about business practices and a little on legal practices. So if you're doing anything yourself that's content-oriented, you have a little bit more information to make that a legal business smooth transaction. So I'd like to introduce to you today, we have Tracey Mack, producer, writer for the television and film industry, and instructor at Vancouver Film School, also the producer and executive producer and writer of the Transmedia series Parked. Tracey? And we have Linda Hay, who's the acting VP of Industrial Relations for the CMPA, which is the Canadian Media Production Association. She's the BC producer branch representative here today. And we have Ben Dobyns, the executive producer and co-director of The Gamers, Hands of Fate, and JouneyQuest for Zombie Orpheus Entertainment. Yeah. And we have our entertainment attorney, Mr. Aren Altman. So what we're going to do today is actually, I have just a few questions to get things started. We're going to have a general free-flowing conversation. And then towards the end, if you have any questions or specific issues that you'd like to have addressed, you could certainly grab the mic and have that opportunity. So we're going to get started right away. First off, just so that we're aware of who's in the audience today, how many of you, just stand up, how many of you are content creators? Stand up if you're a content creator. Okay, looks like about 90% of you are content creators. And stand up if you do anything else. Excellent. Your audience, you're in the background, you're producers, you're in the crew. Excellent. Okay, so this is obviously why there's so many people here, is because most of the people who are content creators aren't necessarily business people or legal people. They create content. So the whole idea tonight is to give you enough information so that you feel a little more comfortable about what these guys can offer you. So thank you for that. So 90% content creators in the crowd. First off, the question just to get things started here is, why should creators care about chain of title, script clearance, errors and omissions, and anything else that an emerging web creator might need? So, Aren, do you want to take a stab at that to get started?
If it's okay with the rest of the panel, sure. It's obvious when people are making content that there's a lot of challenges that they've had to undergo just to choose that as, you know, to be able to stand up and say that's what I do. And if you really want to make something, then the power that you all have to make it, just do it and put it up on YouTube. That's great. But the reason to get things in writing is to make you guys good producers over and over again. And it's, if you see it more in a big picture, then eventually people will ask to see your paper, eventually. So if you don't have it, you may have made a great work, people will love it, they'll know your name, you'll make a lot of friends, but that content's not going anywhere. It'll be your next project.
Anybody else have anything to say? Linda, do you want to pipe in there?
Yeah, I think what we have to take into consideration is sort of a risk management approach. So if you're the sole producer, writer, performer, director in your piece, and you're shooting it in your apartment, then your risk is low, and you might take more chances in not doing paperwork. As soon as you start involving others in that environment, you're stepping outside, you're on location, you are using other people's work as the performer or the director or the writer, then certainly you have to be able to prove that you own your work. And that's what is, like Aren said, somebody's going to ask you for that eventually.
And the two content creators, I mean, both of you have been in the trenches with these experiences. Maybe you can talk about your experiences with this.
Yeah, I think a phrase that I hear a lot is, oh, but I'm just doing this web series with my friends. It's all good. Still have it on paper. contracts are designed, paperwork is designed for when everyone's getting along, everyone's happy. They're designed for when things go wrong. And it's also just a really great way, it's not something to be scared of, it's just a good way to have it written down and make sure everyone's on the same page. So it's not at the end of the day your director's going, oh, but I thought, I was going to be sharing, this percent of the profits, and your co-producing partner goes, oh, but I thought I was sharing this. It just makes it really clear for everyone involved. Everyone knows what the deal is. Everyone knows who owns what, and it lets you still be friends when you're done your series with the same people you started out being friends with.
And Ben?
I agree with all of this. The only things I would add are that I don't know how things work up in Canada, but like down in the States, there's a certain threshold below which, budgetary threshold below which, if you're trying to talk to people about E&O insurance, they're just going to kind of laugh at you. And that's kind of, again, where the risk management and knowing where your audience is. And I'll just leave it at that for the moment.
I don't know if everyone even knows what chain of title is. So if that was missing people, is an errors and omissions insurance, because I mention that to people who've made films, pilots, and have done it already and still are learning after the fact. So essentially, if you can imagine in a more traditional model that for an exhibitor to put your work on a screen, they have to build a building and do all the things that they do, and part of their risk in that business is that they're going to get sued for what goes on in their films. And so they pass the risk on to the producers and say, you are not going to get distributed by us unless you can deliver content to us with insurance. And that reduces the cost of their insurance. So each producer who wants to have their film shown for profit needs to have this insurance. What does that insurance require? It requires me to say to a lawyer who works for an insurance company that I'm comfortable that no one's going to get sued. What does it take to make me comfortable is what I would have suggested to the producers if they had talked to me when they were doing their first web series pilot, and said, get the locations, depending on what the risk is. And everyone that was on the same page with you enough to collaborate with in the first place puts it in writing. And I think Tracey said it, the most important part is the relationship can be improved by it. People shouldn't necessarily be as afraid by it. And the cost is always a factor. There's a lot of resources. So some of the other questions might be about when is it practical?
Two kinds, probably you hear the phrase tossed around, the DICE policy. It's kind of two things, two components of it. These guys might add to it more, but to kind of simplify it, it's kind of two components. One is accident on set, oops, you've knocked over your $100,000 camera and the lens broke. And then there's also the liability component as well. So the liability is if a horrific accident happens on set, something happens and someone decides to sue you, it's also that liability insurance as well. There is a cost to it for sure, but it's also good to strategize a little bit before you get those policies, because a lot of times those policies can be attached to your company. So if you're shooting maybe 2 or 3 web series over the year, you can have that one insurance policy, but kind of, within your head and within your own company, amortize those costs maybe over 2 or 3 different productions.
Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, just adding to that briefly, and again, I can kind of only speak to, I primarily produce in Washington State, but one of the things I always tell people there is, at least with Washington State law, there are certain types of production insurance you can get, but the only way in Washington State to make sure that your cast and crew are covered for injury on set is to make sure that they're not working as volunteers, that they're not working as contractors, because contractors have to carry their own insurance, that they're actually on payroll as employees, because that's, in that state, what gets them covered under L&I, and you're not able to purchase separate insurance for that. So always look at what are your state or provincial or federal or government regulations, because they're going to differ from place to place, and the last thing you want to do is think you're insured, show up, have an accident, and discover that something happened to a volunteer or someone who wasn't covered for whatever reason underneath the policy that you thought you were that was covering you.
So for here in BC, guys, if you're paying people, that's generally Workers' Compensation Board. But I believe there's separate insurance policies that you can actually purchase if you are using volunteers.
I just want to mention about the process of insurance, that from a low budget point of view, insurance is not something that you want to go shopping around for. What you need to do is work with an insurance broker, and that's their job. They then take your project and they shop it around to underwriters. If you try and take your project to various brokers, they're actually just going to the same underwriters for the same information, and they just get very frustrated with you. So you want to find a good insurance broker. There's a couple of great people in town, and they're your friend. They will walk you through the process. They will answer all your insurance questions. You don't have to pay them a dime. Their fee comes out of the insurance policy that you pay for to the underwriter. The underwriter pays them back. And you know, if something should happen and you do have to make a claim, they are also your friend there. They walk you through the whole process, and they are your liaison between yourself and the underwriter. So that is a key person to work with, and it can be very helpful if you're doing anything that has any risk involved. You know, if you're working with stunts or ammunition or anything like that, they really can be very useful in explaining what your risks are.
Again, this answer is going to be particular to where I'm producing, but this is a conversation I've had with my attorney on numerous occasions. In Washington State, if you're shooting something feature length, it's almost impossible to do it legally for under $500,000 because of how the L&I rules and the state labor laws and everything else is constructed. And if you're looking at a feature-length production under that amount, probably somewhere, whether they know it or not, there is a state law that they are breaking, and it makes the process of doing very low-budget film in Washington, a very calculated risk. In that state, if you're doing a commercial work, period, it is not legal to have quote-unquote volunteers on it. Now, of course, you're getting together with your friends, you're making something, you're doing it for the fun of it, and then you're going to try to monetize it later, and you have all your contracts and you have all your other pieces. If the state chooses to, they can still come after you because you've just broken 12 laws.
Fortunately, BC seems to be a little bit more friendly than Washington State, for sure. There's a lot of stuff shot here under $500,000, that's for sure. But again, it depends what you're trying to do. If you're doing something that you need to get a permit from the city to shoot, that automatically means that the city's not going to give you that permit until you have your DICE policy and you have your liability insurance. So right there, there's a cost that you need to budget for. If people are volunteering, that's great. You still want to make sure you get all the paperwork on it, but then, okay, they're volunteering, so it's not under the usual WCB government insurance, so you may still potentially want to look at getting some external insurance to cover your cast, to cover your crew. If you have your own equipment, then maybe, things like, if the equipment gets damaged or something like that happens, that's less important. But if you're going to an equipment house, most likely that equipment house is going to want to make sure that you have some kind of insurance, because if they give you their, red camera and you break it on set, they want to make sure that they're going to get the money from you to replace it. So there definitely are kind of minimums involved and minimums you need, just cost-wise, if you're going to be shooting things. I mean, if you're going out and you're shooting it, on your phone with your friends in your backyard, maybe you can do it for free, but.
So would you suggest, say for an hour of content, say that's the end result is that you want 1 hour of content, how much would you estimate that you should anticipate to spend on fees and insurance and risk management and all that kind of thing?
It's such a range. It could be such a range. Your DICE loss and liability, you're probably looking at around, and these are just estimates because all insurance depends on what you're doing. The moment you're like creating explosions, obviously these costs go up. Your dice, you're probably looking at probably about 1,500. I don't know if that's probably in line with you guys are finding. E&O is probably minimum 3,000 or 5,000, but then you've also got to procure a lawyer as well on top of that cost. So it's not just the errors and omission insurance. You're going to need a lawyer because they're going to need to look at your rough cut and look at your scripts. You might need script clearance. You might need title clearance. The title search can cost you about $1,000. So it just depends on how deep you're going into it.
How
If
elaborate.
you're a union or non-union, if you're doing union, there's paperwork there. Depending on the budget level, if there's minimum salaries you need to pay people or not. It's kind of one of those open questions depending on what you're doing.
Anyone else have comments on that?
Sure. If I tried, I'd say something in the neighborhood of 8 to 14% or 15% of your budget is going to go. I'd try to make it simple by costing it out that way, but so many variables. We just listed off that, which I would agree with. There's probably a divide. If I was to draw it out, some of those costs are one-time costs for the producer. So if you're talking about setting up a production company or getting a set of your own clearance documents for releases, like you'd use them again. Same way that you could get insurance that can cover you for a whole year on multiple productions. So if you're in it for a career and you're considering some of these as your tools the same way as you would for equipment, then it's a really good experience. Or learning to be aware of some of these costs. Maybe this production, for reasons of risk and cost, you don't have backing you up and you cross your fingers. But every problem has happened. Every injury, every miscommunication between partners has happened. So what many of us have found and can help answer questions about is what can be done to prevent them, so that it doesn't cause as big of a problem for you. Minimums. So you don't need a company for sure. You don't need insurance is just a matter of how risky it is. You'll likely be breaking a bunch of laws that people won't be paying attention to. The YouTube exception under the new Copyright Act lets you make original content and get around a lot of copyright protection that was previously in place, so long as you're not making any money from it. And that lets a lot of you create pretty much freely getting up on screen. And if somebody sees it and is upset, then you can at least be happy that someone saw it, and it can launch a career. If a lot of people get mad.
Yeah, I guess any publicity is good
yeah.
publicity, right?
Yeah.
So your question or your comment about copywriting just leads me into another question here. So what are some basic rules about copywriting and copyright infringements?
Me too.
Sure.
Yeah, basic rules of copyright is that by putting something into a tangible form, it's protected by intellectual property rights. And so what that usually is referring to are the protections a person has from having their work copied and being able to go after somebody, but also having to defend yourself by someone coming after you. So taking effort to manage, again, on a spectrum, how much do you want to be protecting your idea? A lot of people come to me early on in a project and want to know how to protect it from being stolen by people. And I said, but you're planning on putting it on YouTube, aren't you? So you need to show your work to people for them to see it and to support you. And that's what a lot of questions I get about copyright. And there's a federal legislation, so it's something that maybe is slightly different in the States, but we're followed closely with Americans, and that is all of these clearance issues that you may have heard about are protecting people's rights from their person, their music work, the trademark of their business. We all have those rights. So when you see things on screen, the hope is that they had permission to do it, and when they don't, they come to me and my colleagues to send nasty letters at each other. And very rarely is it worth the money. We only hear about the cases, and the case law is only supported by those films and those projects that made enough money that it was worth fighting over, spending all that money.
And do you have any comments from the U.S. side?
I have several. I find copyright completely fascinating because you look at it as a tool to protect the rights of creators, but you can also really look at it from the perspective of how much it's been abused in order to essentially, I'm going to say this the wrong way, but to crack down on people who are not infringing with negative intent. And what I mean by that is, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go into a little background here. We release all of our shows under a Creative Commons license. We tell people, take it, download it, share it, pirate it, remix it, do what you want with it. Our next big series that we're releasing, we're even going to allow commercial derivatives. Pretty much unlimited. It's going to be Creative Commons share-alike attribution license, which means that you can do pretty much whatever you want with it as long as you link back to us and you release your work under the same license, which means that you're subject to those same restrictions and those same risks. But that creates a fascinating and complicated situation because basically we have our certain trademarks in place, we have our copyrights in place, and we have a legal responsibility to protect our copyrights from infringement in order to retain them and to retain our intellectual property. So there's kind of been a long process of navigating, okay, how do we use a combination of trademark for some of the really key pieces in order to protect our basic rights there while still participating in kind of this crazy, really open culture kind of project. And a big part of the reason we're doing this is because people are spending, and the studios and the networks are spending so much time and so much money trying to come up with systems to protect their copyright in the face of what the internet does, which is to make perfect, infinite copies of your work at no cost to you. But also you're not seeing any money from it because they're out there on BitTorrent or whatever. And I'm sure you've all heard kind of the analogy, you're like digital rights management, you end up treating your loyal customers with really restrictive DRM where they kind of feel like they're criminals and like they have to jump through all these hoops in order to access their content, and then if Amazon flips a switch somewhere, all of a sudden they don't have their content anymore, versus the people who pirate it who don't have any of those restrictions at all. And that's kind of an upside down way of treating your core fan base and audience. So I really look at this whole copyright area as an opportunity to kind of explore alternatives that really keep that creative control and that ownership with you, but in a way that empowers fans and viewers to interact with your works as part of the culture, rather than feeling like they can only interact with it in a way that is passive and non-infringing.
And then you allow individuals, whoever they are, fans, everybody in the world that loves your content, to take it and then manipulate it and change it into what they want, and then to share it with whomever. Is that correct?
It's even a step further than that. If they want to just rip our content from YouTube and upload it to their channel, based on the license we're releasing this under, they can do that.
Yeah. And so what happens then to your content creation? Because then all of a sudden it's no longer your creation, it's theirs, but they've ripped off your content.
Well, first of all, that's where the attribution part of the license comes back in. Because if they do not attribute the work back to us. And if they do not release it under that same license, we then have absolute clearance to go after them for violating that. So there are protections built in. And what this does for us, kind of our basic philosophy is we're no longer in the business of selling units. We're in the business of creating a sustaining fan base. And it kind of turns the calculus on its head, because now every show, every episode that we release is basically an advertisement for itself. And you want ads to be seen everywhere that they can possibly be seen.
Interesting. Wow. That's very bold of you to be new in this great frontier of ours.
Like particular pitfalls.
Yeah, anything that you think might be a little trip along the way that maybe would be
It
helpful
would be
to
more
know.
general. I go back and try to comfort you guys that being here in this room, you're obviously interested to hear some of these answers. And what I've found as a study of almost the psychology of my clients and of artists, I actually went to art school after law school, and I'm familiar with both sides of myself and my clients in this industry. People know better than to make a lot of the mistakes that they do, and what gets in the way most of the time of taking these precautions and avoiding things is very simple math, and that's that they looked at certain expenses and just apportioned it one way or the other, and that's unchanging. And I think that the other is probably know where to get the information, because Google's there. And the other is that they just don't think that it's going to fit with the feel. They just don't like it. That's the one I don't get. So if you feel like, I just don't feel like calling the insurance guy, I just don't want to talk to the lawyer, or I'd be afraid if I got those contracts that I couldn't really ask people to sign them, and it's going to make me feel like taking this too seriously, and the timing's not right, and all that stuff. If you start feeling that, like, make alarm bells go off in your head, and if there's a gorilla that can hit you on the head and say, wait a second, this is the moment that you'll step on a landmine, forgive the expression, and look back and get, I knew better. I've seen hard drives being held hostage with weeks and months of work on them, and especially if you're using really personal content, like the story of your life, your work, the people you involved in those projects really, really better be prepared to show their loyalty by signing off on it, because if there's problems with that, you can have really far-reaching problems. So those would be a couple, like the saddest cases are where people have to say goodbye to content that really matters. An artist could make a new song and you can make a new movie, but if it was really personal and involved the aspects of your own life or your family, then it would be even worse. If the consequences could be even worse if it doesn't go well.
Excellent. Yeah, Tracey, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, all kind of the business affairs and legal stuff, it's always, a lot of people think, oh, I don't need it. And you know what? If you don't, that's great. But the reason why you do it is you do it for the times you do need it. Because eventually, it may not be this project, it may not be the next project. There probably is going to be, at some point, something that comes up where you're going to need that paperwork in place, and you're going to need maybe that insurance in place. And it's really just protecting yourself. Things like, contracts and paperwork. Contracts are generally designed when everyone's good, everyone's happy, everyone loves one another, and everything's going great. Because ideally, once you sign it, you put it in a drawer, and you never ever have to look at it again. That's the best scenario. So just do it, because once you've done it, you're done. You don't have to look at it again unless there is a problem. It's really the reason why you do the legal, why you do the business affairs, why you spend money on a good lawyer, on a good accountant, is, in case to try and avoid some of those pitfalls, because they do happen. You can borrow a friend's house to shoot in, and something can drop on the floor, and all of a sudden you've got to replace, a $3,000 hardwood floor. I mean, things happen, and you can't always avoid any of them. There's always going to be some strange new pitfall that comes up, but the more paperwork you have in place, the more you're careful with, insurance and keeping your chain of title and really just having a clear, written down understanding with everyone, the better you're going to be able to handle those situations.
And I think that, we also approach, as creators, we approach these sorts of things with fear. And I think it's really good to remember that it's another learning experience. And once accomplished, you really will feel fantastic that you've done it. And the result can actually, if done well, can save you money, because if you get your clearances in place and your chain of title in place and your contracts in place, and then you find that you do have to maybe acquire some errors and omissions insurance or something else, you take your documentation to the lawyer, and if they see what you've done and you've done it right, you're golden, right?
I sometimes think that people say, don't get the lawyers involved, as though that's going to ruin things.
But you guys are
And what
big
I'm
legal
trying
guys,
to,
right?
maybe people do, maybe that's the experience that people have. I won't deny that it can seem that way, but we're trying to show the easy way. Like, this is actually, from our perspective and seeing this through our careers, is probably that all of these things. I think that the panel is trying to get that across, anticipating that you might not be feeling that. So this is in some way a pitch. Not just for the business, but for you to buy into this idea that you're trying to. We wouldn't be here and telling you this if it wasn't really with the intention that it's going to help you. A lot of professionals make it. They're getting paid in other ways, as long as you're upfront, I think that if you ask someone for mentorship, or you make the ask, I need some free advice. How much can you give me and when, sort of thing, as opposed to imposing, making the person give you a favor isn't really a favor.
There can also really be an excitement factor. If you're doing something interesting or unusual or a challenge or that they haven't seen before, that can really turn into, well, let's just sit down and put our heads together and model this out and see what it's going to look like.
Legal question to me.
Between registering and not registering?
Registering and copyright, specifically.
You're registering a copyright. So
Okay.
The copyright is created when you create it. So part of my talk of getting it in writing isn't just contracts. It's in your creating the idea, writing it down. So your treatment, and it's another talk, but it sums it up to say you should have your best elevator pitch and your best treatment, no matter how clear it is in your head. Well, in writing, it also creates intellectual property rights right then and there. So you own what you've created originally. Period. Right. How do you prove that? Is what was one of the things that registering does. So a lot of people are familiar from the music business or otherwise, but the poor man's copyright, where you send yourself registered mail. The idea being that when you were in court, you could open up the registered mail and show that on this date it existed. It only works once. You have to be in court. It's not the best idea, but the principle is essentially sound. And what the registration, at least in Canada, the CIPO, for like $50, you just say, I've created something called this general description, and you've essentially put the world on notice with a very nice piece of evidence that you claim this is yours. And that's, so, and if you came to me and asked me to register a copyright, I would just send you the link. They wouldn't charge you.
If you're talking about what you hope is going to become a recurring series, you have the question, you really have to work out in advance. Okay, here's a production company making this, here's the writer writing it. Are they doing it as work for hire, or are you only getting the rights to one season? What's the ongoing story of where the rights for the next property using that IP comes from? And that's a difficult conversation to have, but a crucially important one.
I know there was that huge deal with Mike Tyson's face tattoo, and I think The Hangover 2, I guess. And whether that was the tattoo or that they blatantly copied his and put it on another actor. If that holds any.
Simple, Don't film tattoos. It's artwork the same as a painting. That's what that case is establishing, and it would be enough to make me tell you to cover it.
Okay.
If you can see it and make it out, and the style is distinct, then the artist behind it. But people do it. It's nice promo for them.
Trey, I don't know of any specifically, but maybe you guys do.
I don't. I've never used any. There are some virtual production office type suites out there that I know people have used. I just use the regular software. The most useful software I've used in the business is Movie Magic Budgeting from a budgeting perspective. There are some good resources out there for finding contract templates online in Canada that are specific to Canadian productions, but I don't have any software advice.
Tracey, do you have any thoughts on that? Or?
Yeah, I mean, there's no easy answer. If you're brand new to production, there's the Women in Film chapter in Vancouver that has a producer's workbook. So that might be a useful place to start. They do have, I believe, a few sample templates in there for things like option agreements. They may have a sample development history or things like that. Development history is what you use as part of your chain of title. So that might be a good place to start if you've kind of never done any of that work before.
Rather than software, I would say look for someone with expertise who's done it before, because they can teach you, they can work with you, and because software is no good if you don't know how to kind of put it to use practically to hit each of these points that you have to get in place to make a production happen.
I think the Bell Fund and also the IPF have some good resources on their websites too in terms of templates.
Here, titles themselves are not copyrighted, right? Like an
Title of a
actual-
show?
Yeah, like you can't copyright a title of anything, right?
Aaron,
Like a book
do
or
you
show
want
or
to
anything.
respond to that?
Close. Yeah. But
So
they
when
want to
you're
know that there's not.
speaking of title search, I was
They
wondering-
need to know that the title wasn't so similar to someone else's, and that applies. I mean, we can't clear TV shows that have same names as movies. So,
Right.
yeah.
But if I had like a short film,
had the same name. Sorry, if I had a short film that had the same name of a book that came out like 40 years ago, or something like that.
We don't like it because we have to then wonder if there was any other element that
oh, I see.
that was going to confuse the public that they
Right.
were related.
Okay.
Yeah. So title is something that when you're applying for insurance, in different circumstances they'll ask, do we need to know the title is clear or not?